is to honor your neighbor. And ikram here means to do good to them, to minimally not harm them. Okay, so to minimally not cause harm. And harm doesn't just mean physical harm, it means distress, it means annoyance, it means inconvenience. To not do these things to your neighbor. And thereafter to do what is good for them, to do good to them. Okay? So this is the second principle. Why is the neighbor emphasized? Because your neighbor is somebody who is because of their close physical proximity to you, they will be much more affected by what you do. Okay, so things that you do will affect them. We would need to consider this, for example, we're having a Mawlid and it's at 1 o'clock in the morning. If there is somebody down the way over there that's trying to sleep, okay, we would need to take cognizance of that. Okay, because we can bring a harm to that person. So the question then is, who is your neighbor? So do good to your neighbor. You'll learn everything else what doing good means. Who is your neighbor? That's the question. Imam Nawawi actually explains this. And he says there are two types of neighbors. Allah mentions them in the Quran. Okay, وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْجُنْبِ. Okay, those who are, if you like, your permanent neighbors and your situational neighbors. These are your two types of neighbors: permanent neighbors or geographical neighbors and situational neighbors. Who are your situational neighbors? Here, each other. Here, in this gathering here, in this retreat, you're all neighbors. We are all neighbors to each other. Okay? Because we are sharing the same space. So all these various announcements that are made about please clean up the kitchen after you clean the toilets, make sure it's in the state that you'd like to find it, blah, blah, blah. This is all falls under ikramul jar. All of this falls under the principle of honoring your neighbor. Love thy neighbor, to put it another way. Okay? To honor your neighbor. We go further than say love your neighbor. We say honor your neighbor. Because you can love your neighbor but still do harm to them. Okay? But when you have to honor your neighbor, when you have to do good to your neighbor, you've got no way out, basically. Okay? So all of this stuff, who gets to sit where, we make wudu, which means that the floor gets wet. Some people come in with their shoes on, which means the floor gets muddy, which means the next person that comes in doesn't know where to place their feet. When they have to make wudu, when they take when they put their foot in the sink, they have to try and somehow, dry their foot standing on one foot, and then somehow slot it back into the shoe, because otherwise their foot's going to get muddy. These are practical things. How do you honor your neighbor? When you use the bathroom, the next person to use the bathroom is your neighbor. That's your neighbor. Same when you're at work. Okay? The next person to use the bathroom after you, that's your neighbor. When you're driving, the person in front of you, the person behind you, the person to your side, these are your neighbors. These are situational neighbors. Why are they your neighbors? Because they are physically close to you, because they are sharing the same space as you, the things that you do are likely to affect them more than they are likely to affect other people. Therefore, you have to have a greater degree of concern for those people around you. Muslim, non-Muslim makes no difference in this regard. Your neighbors are your neighbors. So honoring your neighbor is something fundamental. That's your situational neighbors. What about your geographical neighbors? So where you live, who are your neighbors? So imagine this in terms of concentric circles. You know what that is? Circles within circles. Circles within circles. How many of you married? How many of you are married? Who's your closest neighbor? The person that shares your bed. The person that shares your bed is your closest neighbor. Right? Hopefully not. Yes, your cat. If it is your cat, it is for me. If it is, certainly now my family are overseas, the cat comes and sleeps on the bed. Cat's my neighbor. Yes, actually, the cat is my neighbour. The cat's on the bed, sleeps with me, keeps me company. Okay? So what do? I make sure that when I'm sleeping, I don't, turn over and knock the cat off the bed. This is part of honouring your neighbour. The difference between the awliya Allah and the rest of us is the level of thought that they put into what they do. And therefore they find ways to apply these religious principles in ways that you and I would never have thought of. And it's that care and concern that makes them dear to God. As my Shaykh said to me, talking about a group of people who practice a lot. They do a little practice, and he told me they do so much, they worship so much, they pray so much, they read so much Quran, they do this, do that. How come they're not walis yet? Why aren't they walis yet? Well, why aren't they walis? Because it's not simply about empty actions, robotic actions that become rituals. It's about the thought and the care and concern that you put into those things. And this is something that we need to get good at. Okay? The Sahaba would learn about the intent. They would spend as much time thinking about why they were doing something as they would think about what they were doing. Okay? And this is how we need to be. This is where we lack. We want, the question is always, what should I do? What should I do? What about how should I be? What about that question? We always want to do something. Sometimes, don't do anything. Just think about what you do and why you do it and how you apply it. And you can go very far with this. Okay? So, your neighbour. Who are your geographical neighbours? The person who shares your bed is your neighbour. The people that share your house are your neighbours. Your actual neighbours, the people that live on either side of you. There are certain legal rights that those neighbours have. We won't go into that now. But there are certain legal rights that those neighbours have. How many of you have sold a house? Did you offer the house to your neighbour first?
No, but I'm assuming the sign went up so they knew.
First you have to offer it to your neighbour. Yeah. You have to offer your neighbour, would you like to buy this house? I moved out of my house and moved into a new house recently, and we spent a long time talking to my neighbour, and my neighbour was an old English chap. Him and his wife and his adult son lived there. We spent a lot of time talking to them about the type of tenant, because we still have that house. What type of tenant would they like in the house? Yeah? Why? Who is that tenant? Okay, the tenant, if we don't get a decent tenant, they might do some damage to our property and so forth. But actually, the person that will suffer more is the next door neighbour. They'll suffer more. If these guys are banging on walls and having, blazing rows at 3 a.m. and, throwing garbage into the next door plot, who's going to suffer? We're not going to suffer from that. The next door neighbour will suffer. So this is part of honouring your neighbour. So your actual next door neighbours are your neighbours. The people on your street are your neighbours. And the people in your locality are your neighbours. All of these people are your neighbours. Imam Nawawi goes to the extent to say, Ahlul Madinati Jar. The people of your city are your neighbours. And the extent of those rights, as with the ripple in a pond, the wave gets lower the further out it goes. So the people who have the most rights over you are the closest. Then those who are next, then those who are next, then those who are next. All of this is about what? We as human beings do things that will inconvenience other people, that may harm, the consequences of our actions may harm other people. What this part of the hadith is about is what? Is about saying, be aware of how the consequences of your actions are likely to affect the people around you. That's what this is saying. Yukrim jarahu means this. Think about how the consequences of your actions will affect the people around you. That's what it means. That's why it is linked to faith. That's why it's linked to faith. Okay? Clear? Yes?
Shaykh, how many neighbours would you ask?
Oh no, in terms of the legal responsibility, it's simply the person next door.
Just
The people on either side.
immediate accent.
Yeah.
Not opposite.
No, the reason is, look, I say that. The reason was that in those times, houses obviously weren't very expensive and so forth, and the neighbour may simply want to, I'd like, because my family's growing, I'd like to just expand and incorporate your property into my property and so forth. In certain neighbourhoods, that may be the case, that people want to do that, but it's not always the case, obviously. Okay? Okay?